Learn Medicine Show. In this episode, we are learning about the electrocardiogram. An electrocardiogram is a visual representation of the heart's electrical activity over time. The electrocardiogram records the heart's electrical activity using surface electrodes. Electrodes record the net movement of the heart's electrical activity, and the term vector can be used to describe the direction in which the electrical activity flows. A vector moving towards the electrode will produce a positive deflection in the ECG trace. A vector moving away from the electrode will have a negative deflection, and a vector neither moving towards or away from the electrode will produce an isoelectric line, meaning that the trace is neither positive or negative. The electrocardiographic paper records voltage in millivolts on the y-axis and time in milliseconds on the x-axis. One large square represents 200 milliseconds of time, and one small square represents 40 milliseconds. Two large squares stacked one on top of the other represents 1 millivolt. Let's look now at how the electrical activity produces an ECG trace. An impulse is generated in the sinoatrial node that spreads across the right atrium before moving on to the left atrium. This flow of electrical activity produces two vectors, the first moving towards the electrode and the second moving away from it. The vectors produce a smooth, dome-shaped P wave in the ECG trace. The electrical activity reaches the atrioventricular node quickly, but conduction through the AV node is slowed, and there is a pause of around 120 milliseconds before it is able to get through to the bundle of His and the left and the right bundle branches. The interventricular septum depolarizes, creating a vector that points towards the right ventricle. This leads to a Q wave on the ECG trace. As the ventricles depolarize, an R wave is generated in our trace, and as the impulse spreads to the base of the left ventricle, an S wave is formed. The QRS complex subsequently represents complete depolarization of the ventricles. Repolarization of the ventricles occurs, starting from the outer surface known as the epicardium, moving towards the internal surface, the endocardium. As the cells repolarize, they release positively charged potassium ions into the extracellular space. This generates a positive vector which moves towards the apex of the heart and produces a T wave in our ECG trace. So the take-home message here is that the P wave represents atrial depolarization, the QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, and the T wave ventricular repolarization. So now we have seen how one lead produces a trace, let's take a look at how the 12-lead electrocardiogram is created. The 12-lead electrocardiogram uses 10 leads to produce 12 different views of the heart. The precordial leads are numbered V1 to 6, and these are placed on the thorax in the following anatomical locations. The precordial leads view the heart in a horizontal plane. Here is a horizontal view of the thorax. You can see the heart in the middle of the thorax, and you can also see the 6 precordial leads. I want you to observe now how each of the leads produces different wave forms due to the location at which they are seeing the same electrical activity. Let's make the leads bigger so that we can get a better look at their outputs. You'll note that all views have P waves, QRS complex and T waves, but there are variations in the QRS complexes. For example, if you look at V1, you'll notice that there is no Q wave, and instead we have an R wave and a deep S wave, an RS complex. If we look in V6, however, you will notice that there are Q waves, and subsequently a QRS complex. This is a normal occurrence because Q waves are generally only seen in the precordial leads in leads 4 to 6. The critical thing to note here relates to the QRS complex shape. In V1 and 2, the RS complex is primarily negative. They have a deep S wave which is formed by electrical activity moving away from the electrodes as the left ventricle depolarizes. The QRS complex in leads V3 and 4 are equally positive and negative, and this is referred to as the transition point. In leads V5 and 6, the QRS complex is mainly positive, owing to the vector of electrical activity moving towards these electrodes as the left ventricle depolarizes. The precordial leads can be organized based on the location of the heart that they view. Leads V1 and 2 view the right side of the heart and the ventricular septum. They are often referred to as septal views. Leads V3 and 4 are anterior leads, and they look at the frontal surface of the heart. Leads V5 and 6 are known as lateral leads. They look at the heart from the left side. Now let's talk about the limb leads. These are known as augmented vector right, augmented vector left, augmented vector foot, and neutral. They are abbreviated to AVR, AVL, AVF, and neutral. These are placed in the following anatomical locations. The limb leads view the heart in the vertical plane. The electrocardiogram machine uses these leads to generate 3 other views, and these are known as lead 1, lead 2, and lead 3. Let's take a look now at the limb lead outputs. Let's take a closer look now at the outputs of the limb leads. You'll notice that again we have P, QRS complexes and T waves in effectively all leads, but there are variations again in the QRS complex shape. In AVR, you'll note that most of the waves here are negative. The reason for this is that the vectors producing the waves are all moving away from the AVR lead. The QRS complex in this lead again is an RS wave. If we turn our attention to leads 2 and 3, you'll notice here that the QRS complexes are actually QR complexes. This is a normal variant and still represents full depolarization of the ventricular myocardium. Similar to the precordial leads, the limb leads can be grouped based on the location of the heart that they view. AVL and lead 1 provide lateral views of the heart, and leads 2, 3 and AVF provide an inferior view looking at the heart from below. If we now take each of the views we have generated, we can arrange them in such a way that we can see the outputs from the inferior, septal, anterior and lateral positions, and all of these outputs together produce the 12-lead ECG. So this brings us to the end of our 12-lead ECG video, but don't go anywhere because the next episode is all about interpreting normal and abnormal ECGs. Please make sure you like and subscribe and share this video with your friends because it really helps me out. Thanks for stopping